Much like Islanders from last year, As Far as the Eye is a hyper-paced city builder that sees you proceeding through a series of 30 to 60 minute maps laid out roguelike style. It tasks you with managing a small handful of nomadic tribesmen, but where the roguelike side of the game comes in is that you're outrunning a rising sea level, returning to a place called the Eye on a regular pilgrimage. You show up, strip the land of what you need, and then move on to the next map before the turn counter can catch up with you. And once those maps start piling up into a full campaign, that might sound like a significant time sink, but when most city builders want you to spend dozens of hours crafting a single downtown metro, As Far as the Eye's little 30-minute maps are positively breezy. If perhaps far more interested in the mechanical crunch of sustaining a village's resources than the artistic endeavor of crafting a pretty skyline. And you know me, I'll always leap to cover something that takes a traditionally time-consuming genre and shaves it down into something actually consumable. So as always, I'm Alex, and this is First 5, where I ask if games are worth your time, not your money. I played a game for 5 hours, and I'm gonna tell you if those were 5 hours well spent. And today we're racing ahead of the rising tides in As Far as the Eye. Before we get too deep into the review, I did receive a free review copy of this game, so heads up. As Far as the Eye opens up with a 5-mission tutorial campaign that takes you across twice as many boards over the course of 2 hours. A 2-hour tutorial isn't exactly the way you want to start your roguelike adventure, but As Far as the Eye makes the best of it. They turn it into a full campaign that's engaging in its own right, the same way any RTS might use a campaign to introduce its basic concepts. There's also a simple story that does a good job painting this little nomadic culture in surprisingly few words and actually makes the world feel like a living, breathing, and most importantly, interesting place. The game's got a nice enough art style, but it all doesn't really leap to life until you spend a bit of time learning about the nomads roaming through it. In this case, less is more. Mechanically, however, the opposite holds true. Each mission is blessedly more than just a bunch of text boxes telling you how the game works, often giving you entire missions to complete, even after you've been taught each level's intended lesson. Which, speaking of, there's a ton the tutorial covers. If you just jump straight into a randomly generated campaign, you'll be greeted by this. It's a lavish board, to be sure, but you're also going to need that tutorial or a lot of lost runs to start parsing what anything on it is, because this thing is dense. Conceptually, there isn't actually too much to cover. The basics of how the economy works, a skill tree that more or less correlates one branch of bonuses per each harvestable resource in the game, a few basics like how different buildings work, how to cook food, and how to heal yourself, and a few bells and whistles like explorable ruins. But all of these concepts are pretty tightly interwoven and all layered directly on top of each other, and the tutorial does wonders to help you wrap your head around each one in isolation and equips you with a thorough understanding of how to not starve. This big old tutorial also feels like required reading because once you're out in the wild, As Far as the Eye demands that you hit the ground running. For the first hour or two, it puts you in rather desperate straits, with only 2 or 3 pairs of hands to perform over a half-dozen tasks. You start already stretched thin to nearly the point of breaking, which means you are constantly scrambling around putting out fires. You have to fight for every victory and quality of life improvement you get, and during these opening few hours, the game is at its best. But it also means that one early mistake can cost you a game. For me, something as simple as just forgetting to cook for a few turns led to almost instant death in my camp. I had ample food stocks saved up, but I needed my chef to handle other tasks and just never remembered to send them back. And 3 turns after I was notified of my simple mistake by my tribe members all losing health in unison, my entire population had starved helplessly despite swimming in fish. In the end, the mistake was mine, and I don't have anyone else to blame for it, but it was still a rather sudden and ignominious end to what until then had been a largely successful effort. This isn't an isolated story either. I've been suddenly leveled by disease in 3 or 4 turns after humming along just fine for hundreds, and I've even taken a look at my randomly assembled starting party, felt the game already looked almost impossible to win, and restarted a new seed without playing a single turn. As Far as the Eye is very clear that it is a game about preparation, and it is tuned as such. Personal mistakes and disasters the game throws at you can cause devastation in moments that can take dozens of turns to recover from. You have ample opportunity to play in contingencies that can blunt these disasters, but if you don't do so ahead of time, this game is unsympathetically swift to throw an hour or more of your time in the trash over the minutest errors. And this is part of what makes the beginning of the game so brutal, because you haven't had time to build the population or the infrastructure to insulate against an untimely mistake. All you can do is make sure you don't commit them in the first place. But once you're over that initial curve, there's very little as far as the eye can do to really slow you down, and this becomes its own problem. Because in order to get that far, you already have to have contended with every threat the game can throw at you with one arm behind your back. The only way you'll ever get strong enough to take a hit is by learning how to not get hit in the first place. To put it in perspective, when I did eventually win a game, the last 3 zones took me the same amount of time to get through collectively as the first zone did on its own. The back half of the game is almost a formality, the hours-long hike home after you already survived your Bear Grylls Man vs. Wild adventure. And looking back, I actually kind of missed the tutorial campaign a bit, with its shorter, more focused challenges that set up a problem you had to solve and genuinely interesting glimpses into the Nomad's culture to keep me invested. And after wrapping that adventure, it's also time to wrap up this review and ask the big question. What do you get out of 5 hours with As Far as the Eye? If you sat down at minute 1, immediately started up a roguelike campaign, and didn't mess up a single time, you would be able to see the end of a single run of As Far as the Eye. Obviously, that is a dream scenario that you're not going to have, so it's hard to say that you're going to be able to get a complete experience in just 5 hours, and that's also ignoring the fact that after you're done, you can go through 3 more times with different preset tribes. I personally went a few extra hours with this one, just to see that windscreen, and in the end, I think As Far as the Eye is a reasonably enjoyable experience, but I also have complicated feelings on whether to recommend it or not. At first blush, a roguelike with 5-hour-long runs probably sounds like it requires a hefty time commitment, but after finishing the game once, I don't feel much desire to go back and do it again. Looking back, the fun wasn't the actual moment-to-moment gameplay, it was simply exploring and mastering a new system, tinkering about with a new puzzle. And paradoxically, that means that through its own inability to hold my interest, I actually think that this is a reasonably short game. I came, I saw, I won a game, now I'm satisfied and ready for a new one. And there's part of me that feels like I'm coming down a little too hard on As Far as the Eye. Obviously, this game was fun enough that it convinced me to keep playing it longer than I had to, but I still feel like the game's merely average, a perfectly reasonable buy if it looks interesting, but don't expect it to absolutely wow you. You can get that feeling of exploring and mastering a new mechanical system almost anywhere in the medium, so As Far as the Eye feels hard to specifically recommend over other games that might already be vying for your limited time. But if you are looking for something new to mess around with, you can do a lot worse. Hey guys, if you like what you're seeing here, consider supporting me on Patreon. With your generous support, I can start doing all kinds of cool stuff, like more in-depth video essays and 5-hour streams where I review games like this in real time. So if any of that sounds cool, please consider becoming a patron today. But I hope you enjoyed this first 5 review. Thanks for watching this far, and I'll see you all next week.